أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إذا كان الموظفون هم عماد السياسة كما يقول المثل، فماذا يمكننا أن نتعلم من تعيينات دونالد ترامب للمناصب العليا في إدارته الجديدة؟ في الأيام التي تلت انتخابه الرئيس الجديد، وهو أول رئيس ينتخب لفترتين غير متتاليتين في البيت الأبيض منذ غروفر كليفلاند قبل 130 عاما، أعلن عن بعض الأسماء المريحة لشغل مناصب مهمة. فكبير موظفي البيت الأبيض ووزير الخارجية ومستشاره للأمن القومي كانت كلها خيارات تقليدية للغاية. ثم أعلن عن بعض الأسماء غير العادية لشغل مناسب تتراوح بين الدفاع والاستخبارات والصحة والتعليم. عدد قليل جدا منهم من الأشخاص الذين خدموا في إدارته الأولى، وبعضهم لم تكن لديهم أي خبرة سابقة. ما الذي قد يعنيه ذلك بالنسبة للسياسة في إدارة ترامب؟ وكيف سينظر العالم إلى اختياراته؟ وكيف باشرت دول مختلفة بتعديل سياساتها بالفعل ردة على ترامب؟ لمناقشة ردود الفعل المبكرة على الإشارات المتعلقة بالسياسة الأشخاص القادمين من مقر ترامب بمارلاغو، يسعدني أن أرحب باللجنة من الخبراء السياسيين ديفيد ريني، جون أولدريتش وأليكس Gangitano. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. So Donald Trump has filled out just about all of his top administration jobs, at least the appointments, pending Senate confirmation. That should be an interesting process. In broad strokes, if personnel is policy, what do we know? We're going to ask David Rennie, John Aldrich, and Alex Gangitano. Thank you all for joining me this morning. All right, if personnel is policy, David, what do we know?
Well, we know that, as you would expect with Donald Trump, it is, if you're a Trump supporter, you would say he is keeping his options open. And if you are a Trump skeptic, you would say it looks fairly chaotic because there are some people with extremely different views on all of the big economic questions, but also foreign policy questions. It's a kind of potential cacophony. But if you're a Trump supporter, you say that's how he likes to roll. He likes to have different views, and then he takes the final decision.
All right, John, in broad strokes, what does personnel choice say about the future?
Well, I mean, to say one thing as a transition on this question, this being a transition, I believe some of these appointments are reflecting the success in the election and sort of rewarding people for supporting the election. Some of them are, of course, preparing for the future. Most of them, all of them are, in a sense. It seems to me that he has doubled down on two particular things. One of them is that he has moved very, very strongly into the billionaire level set of appointments, which is maybe not surprising, but somewhat atypical from being a populist. And the second is that he has been avoiding what he would consider the deep state type people, dramatically so, and picking people from very different circumstances and walks of life and so forth.
All right, interesting. And Alex, when you look at the choices, what pattern for you emerges?
Yeah, I think two things that he's doubling down on policy-wise are the two main things that he ran on, which is stricter immigration policy and tariffs. And so we're looking at people that he's put up for immigration posts, even for national security level posts, but with a focus on curbing the influx of migrants, with a focus on being able to work with, or not work with, but maybe just warn Mexico and other countries against sending in their people or allowing their people into the U.S. So I think we're seeing some really hard line people on that front that will go through on his campaign promise. And then on the tariff front, we're seeing people that are accepting of really high tariffs on goods from places like Mexico and Canada. That's not going to fight him on it. It's something he ran on. So, the likes of Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary, I think that's someone who Trump's looking at. He's my guy who's going to do whatever I want on this issue of tariffs, which was a winning issue for me, and Americans want to see what I end up doing with it. So I think he's really doubling down on those things. And like David mentioned, it's going to come down to he's the decision maker at the end. He puts these people in place, but at the end of the day, he's going to be the one that makes the call.
All right, let's do a quick lightning round of questions. For you, Trump's most reassuring pick, David.
I guess Marco Rubio, if you are concerned about America pulling out of big alliances like NATO, is a conventional, at least used to be, a completely conventional anti-autocracy, anti-communist conservative with a Cuban-American background. He has become a lot more Trumpy in recent months, perhaps as he saw a big job coming and is now willing to ditch support for Ukraine in order to focus on China. But he's still, I think, if you're an ally of America, wondering if America First leaves any room for alliances, Marco Rubio would be a reassuring pick.
John, most reassuring pick.
Well, I agree that Rubio is one of the few exceptions of people who look like the old Republican Party adapting to Trump. But a number of governors, they're often unusual people, but they have their own base of support that and that gives me some reassurance on them.
Okay. Alex, most controversial pick.
So Pete Hegseth was, I think, the most controversial. He's the defense secretary pick, but he's improving a bit in terms of support from the Hill. So I actually think right now Tulsi Gabbard, the pick for director of national intelligence, is coming out as the most controversial, not just because she's not experienced or necessarily qualified for the job, according to some, but she also has alliances with the likes of a Putin or a former leader of Syria and Assad, and her alliances are definitely raising some concerns from people.
And when you say controversial, is that the equivalent of most likely not to get confirmed?
Yes, I think so. I think if senators have to choose their battles of Republican senators, I think they would pick on her the most because, they're not going to just nitpick because they don't want, Trump coming down on them if they are too cavalier with who they allow through and don't allow.
Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. What are we supposed to make of DOGE, David, the Department of Government Efficiency?
There is, every government that comes in says it can save extraordinary amounts with efficiency. It's kind of magic money. You don't have to raise taxes. You don't have to cut things that people care about, like Social Security. You can find it with government efficiencies. The difference this time is that Elon Musk does have a track record, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, of buying big companies. Remember, he bought Twitter, the social media platform, fired, I think 80% of staff, I think is a figure I remember. And that then left the company in pretty rocky shape. It's actually lost a lot of value. But he is a guy who cuts first and then sees what the consequences are later. An important caveat, though, is that Washington insiders will tell you that the machine is more complicated than kind of swashbuckling billionaires often think. And we should note that Doge has a catchy name. It's the name of a cryptocurrency that Elon Musk often pumps. But it isn't actually an American government department. He isn't going to be formally a cabinet secretary. So we'll see whether the swamp that, they promised to drain last time round manages to kind of slow down their cutting and slashing.
And John, when you look at Doge and what it's likely to produce, what's the maximum that's going to come out of this in realistic terms?
So the maximum are going to be proposals that other people within the administration and then usually, of course, Congress are going to have to work over. So I think it's going to be an extremely long process before there are any proposals are turned into action. Most likely, it's going to be a very thick volume of things that will hold your door open.
Hold your door open. Got it. Now, Alex, when you look at this overall group of appointees, is this a harmonious group? Where are the sharp elbows? And where are the internal fights? On which issues are we likely to see conflict among this group of appointees?
That's a good question. I mean, it definitely looks like not a harmonious group. It looks like a very scattered grouping of people, besides the fact that, like John mentioned, there are a large amount of billionaires in the group. There are some people that have been indicted or served jail time in the group. I mean, we have some people that are have some common themes and elements. But I think in terms of where there could be some infighting, I think we're looking at some establishment figures like a Senator Marco Rubio, knows how Washington works, knows how the Senate can function. He will get, Democratic support for his nomination. And then we're looking at some people like an Elon Musk, although he's not in the cabinet, so bad example, but maybe a Pete Hegseth, if he were to get confirmed, that just, think that you can come in and maybe bulldoze and not need, to do things in the traditional way of Washington. But I do think what was kind of a reminder of the tradition of Washington, of the more Marco Rubio like-minded people that could be joining this cabinet, was when Matt Gaetz he had to withdraw his name from the nomination. That was because senators didn't support him, and that was just went through the typical way of, there are checks and balances on the system, and if you don't have the support from Washington, your idea, your confirmation might not get through. And so I think there's going to be some learning curves for some of these folks coming in to realize that you can't just do whatever you want, and there is, even though the Senate will be Republican, the House will be Republican, there are still checks and balances.
And John, when you look at this group, do you see any blatant policy clashes that are likely to emerge?
Well, I think it's instructive that we picked Rubio and Alex picked appropriately Gabbard. Both of them are in the sort of defense and international. That is a remarkably diverse group that gives us almost no sign at all about, sort of what path the Trump administration is going to go. And it could be a big brawl, or it could be, and this is one of the things that people who are not as familiar, who are familiar with parliamentary governments or over our government, to remember is that cabinets often contain people who are very important to the government, but often contain people who are basically ciphers doing mere administrative work and have very little influence within the presidential administration itself. So you can't tell until the machine is actually running.
And David, when you look at this group, is there an issue that you think is likely to emerge in the early weeks as a point of great contention?
First term, where you literally had kind of establishment conservative Republicans who Donald Trump chose because he felt that, they were the right sort of people to choose. People like Scott Tillerson, his first, Rex Tillerson, his first Secretary of State. And they ended up actually annoying Trump because they were much more conventional than he wanted to be. I think there is a clear sign that this time around, these are people who know that their job is to be ultra loyal. So where could the policy differences emerge? I think it's because you hear already people interpreting the Trump kind of wisdom in different ways. So take an issue like tariffs. Right out of the door, on day one? Are we going to see enormous cross-the-board tariffs, potentially very high tariffs on China? Some of the loyalists taking, top seats in the Trump team, they're saying, well, of course, he doesn't actually love tariffs forever. He's just using this as a negotiating tactic. There'll be, endless allies will be able to give exemptions. We're not going to start a trade war. There are other people in the top team, people like Peter Navarro, to some extent, actually, Howard Lutnick, the new Commerce Secretary, who seem to love the idea of tariffs in a much more kind of let them stick around as a tool of policy to protect American industry from foreign competition. And so it's not that people are going to disagree with Trump, but there are going to be fights among the loyalists about what Trump really means by core policies like tariffs.
Interpreting the oracle. All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to do a little comparison between Trump 1 and what Trump 2 is shaping up to look like in just a moment. For today's show, I'm delighted to welcome David Rennie. David is the geopolitics editor and author of The Telegram, a column on geopolitics at The Economist. Previously, he served around the world as The Economist's European Union correspondent, Washington bureau chief, and Beijing columnist. Also joining us is John Aldrich. John is Pfizer Pratt Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. He's authored several books on American politics and the discipline of political science, including Why Parties Matter and Before the Convention. And with us today is Alex Gangitano. Alex is White House reporter at The Hill, where she was previously the lobbying reporter. Earlier in her career, Alex was a staff writer for CQ Roll Call, where she also authored Heard on the Hill. Alex, there were surprisingly few appointees in Trump's new term that served at high positions in his first term. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Peter Navarro is coming back as a White House aide, but otherwise there's not a lot of friendly faces. And I think what familiar faces from the first term. And I think it's similar to what David was talking about is in the first term, Trump had some people come in who were typical Washington establishment types, longtime Republicans, to kind of test out how do we work with Washington and let's bring in some people who know how to do that. This time around, he's bringing in people who supported him on the campaign trail, who have supported him for the past 8 years or so, who are loyalists through and through. I mean, like a Kristi Noem as a governor, she'll be coming in to work on immigration issues. I mean, these are people that were standing by him on the campaign trail. And so it does look a lot different, but I think he learned in the last go round that if he appoints people that aren't his loyalists, he will get, people pushing back on his ideas and maybe even talking to the press. Those anonymous sources talking about how chaotic he can be. He wants to end any of that and just have people that look at him as, whatever Trump wants, Trump gets. And so I think that's why we're seeing not a lot of the same faces. Of course, Mike Pence is a glaring example of that. He didn't even have him run for his vice president again because they butted heads at the end, especially over January 6th when Trump lost to President Biden, and he doesn't want somebody who will butt heads with him.
But David, even loyalists who ended up the first Trump term on very good terms with the president, like Robert O'Brien, his national security advisor, or Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, nowhere to be found. Is that odd, or is there meaning behind this?
I think that there is a sense that loyalty is just now overshadows all else. And I think one sign of that is, in some ways, the new American administration looks more like a kind of Middle Eastern monarchy. There are, any number of members of Trump's family and extended family in high positions of office. And I think, there's the father of his son-in-law, there's the father of his daughter-in-law, There's, you can go down the list of these figures who've been given quite important jobs, like ambassador to Paris or Middle Eastern envoy. And I'm sure many of them are fine, upstanding people. But I think that dynamic is going to be quite interesting, because one of the things we know about Donald Trump is that he's very fond of firing people if he senses a flicker of, any kind of confrontation or any kind of resistance to his ideas. Is it going to prove harder to fire his own family? At the least, it's going to make Thanksgiving a little complicated.
John, do you see the hand of Vice President-elect J.D. Vance behind any of these most senior appointments?
Well, it's hard to say that it's actually Vance's doing, but it's a set of people, about a third of whom I think Vance would feel very comfortable with were he to succeed to the presidency. Whether he actually, proposed and pushed these individual people or not, I'm not so sure. But he's had, I think, a much more substantial influence on Trump's set of appointments than, say, Mike Pence did 8 years ago. I'd like to point out too that one of the reasons we see a lot of change from first term to second term, I think we've moved from a point where Trump said, I don't really know how to be president, to I'm absolutely confident I know how to be president.
And well, let me ask you, John, this mixed message of people in policy, do you think that's by design or just by happenstance?
I think it's by design. I think he's very carefully planned that to maintain the maximum flexibility he has for what he wants to do, because since he's not driven by ideology, it's not like even he can sort of figure out how he's going to respond to the next international crisis, the next financial crisis. And this gives him maximum flexibility to pick his way, and then who he can work with to act on it.
Very interesting. And Alex, when you look at this group, do you see a group of individual loyalists, or do you see, as John just suggested, an actual strategic design in putting this all together?
I think a strategic design, in the sense that these are all individualists. They all have very varying backgrounds, but I think they all are coming in with the very clear task of just putting forth what Trump wants to do. And I think they're all pretty aware of why they've been picked, and that's because they're loyalists, and that's because they have been loyal to him. I think, we saw optically the Army-Navy game here in the U.S. It's a big tradition, and Trump was there surrounded by several of these picks, and they looked like a cohesive group, even though they are a very diverse group in terms of their background. I think they're just all there because of Trump, and they are going to be able to work together because of him. But I think that, to John's point, it's a very good one, is that they might not all have the same ideas, and that allows Trump to, if he wants to change gears in a moment's notice, which Trump has been known to do, if he wants to change his mind about a policy issue, there's going to be someone in the cabinet who is either ready to change their mind or already has his back about that change. So I think he's done this strategically so that he always has somebody agreeing with him in all walks throughout the next 4 years.
I can tell you, having traveled in the Middle East quite a bit in just recent weeks, there is excitement and anticipation from Morocco all the way through the Gulf, among countries that don't normally agree with each other, whether the Turks and the Israelis, for example. They're all looking forward to having Donald Trump back in the White House. We'll see whether it's the concern or the anticipation that wins the day. I want to thank you all, David Rennie, John Aldrich, Alex Cangitano, for helping decipher what's going on with transition here in Washington. Thank you for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. وإلى هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات، وخاصة حول الأشخاص الذي اختارهم ترامب لأهم المناصب في إدارته. أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.